Can I ask Michalinos to come to join me here, Asipe, Ayanda, and Roxana, just to jump out from the online Zoom and just say hello to the people here, perhaps? Right, so this is our last session for the day, and as you can imagine, from session to session, just affirming the deep work that people put into the presentations and the commitment that they have to making the event a success. And so we are very grateful for that, Nomalanga. And so for our last session, we will have a provocation on the new questions about the university and critical university studies in Techno-Rational Times, Decolonial Options. Michalinos will have 30 minutes to present, and then each of the disputers will have 15 minutes per speaker. I'll try and keep that as tight as possible. We will then have time for an open response so that we stay to the kind of 20 to half an hour lateness of the program that we have and not try to go beyond being half an hour late. Okay, I'll try my best, colleagues, and I will need everybody's support for that. So please give a hand. Oh, Michalinos, I have to introduce you. Yeah. No, the people, I get assessed by my staff here, So I already, yesterday it was 4 out of 10. That's actually, but I can do a re-exam on that score. Michalinos Zembylas is a professor of educational theory and curriculum studies at the Open University of Cyprus, an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University, South Africa, and an adjunct professor at the University of South Australia. Roxana Chiapa, who will come in just before the two of you, disputer number 1, is currently based at the University of Tarapachu, Chile, where she works as an assistant professor. In addition, Roxana is an associate researcher at Rhodes University, South Africa, and adjunct researcher at the Center for the Study of Conflict and Social Cohesion. Then Asipe Kalisa, disputer 2, is currently doing a PhD at Rhodes University, and she is a director at Evoke Research Primary Cooperative, and also currently the chairperson of the Gender Action Forum at Rhodes University. And Ayanda Simai, disputer. Dr. Simai is a lecturer at the Faculty of Education at Nelson Mandela University. Thank you so much for all agreeing. Michalinos, it's over to you. Give him a hand, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Andre, Michael, Dina, for inviting me. Thank you also Jenny and Michaela for taking care of all the logistics. It's been a wonderful 3-day event, so I hope this is a good ending. My provocation emerges from a set of concerns that the university and critical university studies in Techno-Rational Times will not be adequately address how coloniality continues to impact higher education institutions unless various decolonial options are explicitly considered, among other options, of course, that have been explored at this colloquium in the past few days, such as black feminism, abolitionism, and other theories and practices. Yet, I want to make clear from the beginning that it is not enough to engage in what has become known as intellectual decolonization, which is very much a response aligned to the zeitgeist of Techno-Rational Times, understood here as the efforts to challenge the legacy of colonialism within universities by dismantling the intellectual roots of academia, namely how knowledge is produced, taught, and legitimated. These efforts are undoubtedly valuable, but they are inadequate because they are often tokenistic, in the sense that changing only curricular pedagogies and knowledge production gives the appearance of decolonization, whereas the colonial structures of universities remain intact. Without under or overestimating the value of intellectual decolonization in Techno-Rational Times to dismantle the colonial master's house and its tools, my provocation today turns our attention to a rather neglected decolonial option, namely affective decolonization. I will argue that affective decolonization is a fit, critical response to some aspects of techno-rationalism and its manifestations in higher education. Affective decolonization, of course, is not a new idea. Frantz Fanon, André Lorty, Barbara Smith, Gloria Alzadua, among others, wrote about the power of engaging affect in feminist and decolonial struggles, yet the affective complexities of higher education decolonization have not been explored much in the critical university studies literature. In general, the affective elements of decolonization are the embodied experiences of anger, love, guilt, solidarity, to name just a few examples, that characterize the complex affective contours of coloniality and decolonization. In this sense, affective decolonization is the idea that decolonization has to also happen at the level of affective life. Therefore, the notion of affective decolonization complements the decolonization work taking places in other realms, intellectual decolonization, territorial decolonization, and so on. I will speak about those soon. By exploring what it would mean to decolonize the deeply affective structures and sensibilities of coloniality. That is to undo the emotive lessons, as Nitu Kana says, of coloniality. In the context of higher education institutions, these emotive lessons may be seen in the affective practices and habits emerging from and associated with Western knowledge production, research, pedagogies, administrative structures, evaluation processes, and so on. I quote Achille Bembe here. For example, the claims of objectivity, the norms of peer review in academia, competitiveness, individualism, and so on. In this provocation, then, I want to suggest that the affective dimension of decolonization offers educators, researchers, students, administrators in higher education institutions the potentiality of a radical affective reconstitution, namely the possibility of enriching attempts to decolonize the university by taking into account ways of undoing the emotional lessons of colonialism. Undoing apartheid, for example, Primesh, you suggested it's an aesthetic education. I add it's also an affective education. So the dominant imperial order of knowledge production is based on a matrix of hierarchies and exclusions embedded within colonial economies of affect. For example, and I quote Agathangelu here, the emotions of subordinated, colonized communities and subjects are routinely ignored or even do not register, end of quote. Taking into account of ways of undoing the emotive lessons of colonialism then challenges scholars both in the global north and global south to interrogate the coloniality of affects, as this is manifested in the sector of higher education, indicating that much work remains to be done for decolonization at many levels. I will begin by saying a few things about decolonial theories and decolonial thinking, focusing on particularly on intellectual decolonization and its limitations. Decolonial theories and decolonial thinking more generally consist of various critiques of colonialism and coloniality, the coloniality of power and knowledge, land appropriation, racial, gender, and geopolitical hierarchies, and claims of universality rooted in Eurocentric knowledge and values. due to time limitations, my analysis here cannot do justice to the diversity and complexity of decolonial thinking in various geopolitical contexts. For example, South America and Africa are just two of them. So it will mainly highlight that decolonization is a contested term that entails several dimensions that are inevitably intertwined. For example, there is territorial decolonization that is achieved by the dissolution of colonial relations when it comes to issues of land and governance. There is structural decolonization that seeks to dismantle colonial power relations, values, and norms that are present in various realms of social, political, economic, and cultural life, including higher education institutions. There is also intellectual decolonization that focuses specifically on dismantling the Western intellectual superiority that it forms education at all levels, curricula and pedagogy included, including research and so on. Intellectual decolonization then emphasizes the dismantling of the intellectual legacies of empire, emerging from the hierarchies and exclusions embedded in Eurocentric forms of knowledge. In recent years, intellectual decolonization has become so popular that it has been referred to as a decolonial bandwagon. That's Moussavi's expression, Leon Moussavi, which drifts, and I quote, everything from sexualities to cameras, from dieting to counseling, from disability to peace building, end of quote. The origins of this decolonization hype or vogue around decolonization in higher education, according to some scholars, can be traced to two predominant student-led movements which appeared in 2014 and 15, Roads Must Fall and Why Is My Curriculum White? Both of which challenged the legacies of colonialism within universities as those were manifested in statues, buildings, curricula, and knowledge production in general. Obviously, Fees Must Fall is included in that. This decolonization hype does not mean, of course, that there was no prior academic work on decolonization or that the new enthusiasm for decolonization has been universally endorsed by universities, especially in the global north. It simply shows that there is growing attention to various dimensions of decolonization, which may be an opportunity for rethinking the strengths and weaknesses of what decolonization would look like when we are severing connections with colonizing infrastructures in universities around the world. It is crucial that efforts towards decolonization in higher education are not taken at face value, but rather they need to be scrutinized so that nuanced readings of decolonization can be advanced. It is worthwhile, therefore, to briefly revisit some of the limitations of intellectual decolonization. And I'm drawing here on the work of Leon Moussavi to outline some of these limitations, and I will focus on 4 of those. The first limitation is that intellectual decolonization is not easy and perhaps not even possible unless it is accompanied by serious structural changes. For example, decolonization is not going to be accomplished by simple tasks such as critical self-reflexivity, namely an academic intellectual exercise of looking into one's self, but rather there should be specific actions how decolonization can be practically realized. A second limitation discussed by Moussavi is that intellectual decolonization may often essentialize or appropriate the notion of global south. If the term global south is treated as an essentialist category that fails to capture the multiplicity of ideas and cultures in different socio-political settings, Africa and Latin America, for example, there is likely that people and ideas from different parts of the global south will be excluded. This essentialism also fails to include alternative southern perspectives, especially not elite ones. In this sense, the assumption that global south has an innate essence that can be known and captured reproduces a colonial generalization. The same, of course, with Global North. A third limitation discussed by Mousavi is the tendency towards nativist decolonization. That is the glorification of Southern scholarship just because it is from the global South. Nativist decolonization then gives the impression that decolonization is a trivial undertaking in the interest of fulfilling Southern insecurities. In addition, there is a danger of producing further distrust for anything that comes from the global North just because it is Northern. Finally, a fourth limitation comes from tokenistic decolonization. Tokenistic decolonization makes little effort to undo coloniality, and in some cases may even reaffirm colonial structures because it fails to take radical action. An example of this is taking a minimalistic approach or a soft reform approach, in the words of Vanessa Andreotti and her colleagues, namely an approach that makes superficial changes such as adding some resources in the curriculum to acknowledge Aboriginal or African people's contributions, rather than taking concrete actions that aim at dismantling the persistent efforts of colonial violence, actions that address the economic inequality suffered by students from marginalized communities, actions that change exclusionary policies of access in universities, and so on. Generally speaking, then, the intellectual decolonization is a necessary undertaking as part of the multifaceted process of decolonization, yet the limitations of intellectual decolonization invite scholars in critical university studies to consider other decolonial options that may enrich efforts at the intellectual level and evoke the importance of being action-oriented in the pursuit of a decolonial agenda. I would argue then that this agenda can be greatly enhanced by considering affect as a fundamental site of challenging colonial subjugation and invoking emancipatory affective reconstitution. Now, one of the best known, perhaps most widely cited examples of colonial affect is Fanon's description of the encounter between the colonized black body and a young white child on the train. I'm sure you are familiar with this quote. In this remarkable example, Fanon shows the powerful impact of socio-historical forces, of bodily experiences, reinforcing not only how we feel, but also how we are capable of feeling and with whom. Affectivity is central to Fanon's account of the black colonized consciousness, as well as his theories of decolonization. Importantly, Fanon rejects the idea of human affects as a biological phenomenon, but rather argues that affectivity operates within histories of racism, colonialism, and other fears of bodily difference. Drawing on Fanon, Sarah Ahmed also argues that what bodies tend to do are the effects of history. There are no universal human affects and emotions because affects and bodies are always situated in specific socio-historical settings. Ahmed writes of the ways in which the circulation of affective value shapes bodies and words, demonstrating how affects and emotions construct racial recognition. In this sense, affects are inscribed within particular relations of power, that is, the violence of colonial power and difference. For example, the emotional expressions of those perceived as different from the white colonizers have historically been deemed as reactive, impulsive, and exaggerated, often in racialized ways. More recently, Neetu Khanna, in 2020, in her wonderful book entitled The Visceral Logics of Decolonization, argues that it is within such racialized affective scenes that we need to reimagine the potentialities of decolonization. However, as she points out, interventions that simply aim at a change of heart, as we say, without accompanied by specific actions or structural changes, will not take the process of decolonization very far. For example, adding in the curriculum sentimental narratives about the sufferings of racialized others in response to the empathy-desiring norms of whites' privilege is not only inadequate to break up the racialized affective norms, but also provides the false illusion that it has an important effect. In this sense, this intervention is tokenistic, having all the limitations mentioned earlier. I argue, therefore, that a crucial move to enrich existing intellectual decolonization efforts is recognizing how embodied repositories of colonized and racialized experiences continue to be reproduced in everyday encounters. What an affective dimension of decolonization adds to the intellectual work of decolonization is enabling us to ask two fundamental questions about how we may identify and interrupt the relentless reproduction of the coloniality of affects. In the context of higher education, for example, these questions may be formulated as following. How do universities, especially in the global north, reinscribe structures of feeling that reiterate normative processes of affective racialization and racial subjugation through their everyday mechanism of teaching, learning, evaluation, and management? In which way can contemporary universities around the world engage in affective decolonization along these different mechanisms? These rather broad questions provide scholars in critical university studies a guide of working toward a decolonial praxis that recognizes the fundamental impact of affective decolonization. Attempts by researchers, educators, students, and administrators in higher education institutions to address these questions will create openings for raising difficult issues, such as how privileged academics and students may be incentivized to engage in decolonial dialogue and praxis, or how it is possible for university administrators and leaders to disinvest affective energies in a toxic set of colonial infrastructures, but rather build university systems that are equitable and decolonizing. Essentially, universities that abolish themselves as we know them today. At the same time, it is important to emphasize that there are always possibilities for constructing new ways of feeling as a site of radical transformation that reimagines a different human collective, one that undermines normative affective ways of colonization and racialization. These visions, write Kana, and I quote here, could be a site of radical relearning. These emotive and embodied repositories of the body must be the sites of revolution precisely because empire has already monopolized them. End of quote. For these reasons, argues indigenous scholar Diane Million, it is crucial to include in decolonization efforts the lived experiences of indigenous peoples, rich with emotional knowledges, namely what pain and grief and hope meant or mean now in our pasts and future. It is exactly this emotional knowledge, he points out, that fuels the real discursive, affective, and eventually political shift around the painful histories and stories of indigenous populations. To break the monopoly of the empire, then, there has to be significant work done at various levels, including the level of affective decolonization, not only to recognize the ways in which affect serves as a racializing technology in everyday encounters, but also to invent new affective practices through which the exploitation of colonized bodies can be disrupted. This is an example of the practices that Crane was talking about yesterday. So in the last part of my provocation, then I will try to give you a practical example of what I mean by discussing how a particular affect namely decolonizing solidarity, to fit with the theme of our colloquium, can serve a number of strategic functions in the process of affective decolonization. In particular, I will explain what this example means for decolonial efforts in higher education. Now, solidarity is generally a concept that expresses a standing with. This is how I understand it. This is Kim Tolbear, an indigenous scholar from Canada. Standing with others based upon the recognition of a common experience, a common humanity, a common ideology, a common political agenda, a common moral vision, and so on. Therefore, there are different kinds of solidarities. There are political solidarities, leftist solidarity, for example. There are rights solidarity, focused on human rights violations. There is material solidarity, disaster aid, and so on. Solidarities also vary in their manifestations and motivations. They can be expressed at the macro level by voting for a political party that supports a leftist agenda, for example, or they can be expressed at the micro level by taking individual or group action in response to an injustice or oppression. As Lynch and Galainzaki explained, then solidarity, and I quote, is simultaneously an object or goal of politics, a set of socio-political practices realizing such politics, and a disposition towards practice. End of quote. The concept of affective solidarity by Claire Hemmings is a manifestation of solidarity that has been initially grounded in feminist politics against neoliberalism attempts to individualize and isolate us. As Claire Hemmings argues, the basis for affective solidarity is affective dissonance. That is a range of affects such as anger, frustration, rage, that provide a productive grounding for sustainable politics of transformation. In other words, affective solidarity is not based in a shared identity or a presumption about how the other feels, but on feeling the desire for transformation out of the experience of discomfort and against the odds. As Hemmings writes, in order to know differently, we have to feel differently. I highlighted this part. There it is. Hemmings then positions embodied knowledge at the heart of affective solidarity. This has important political implications, as the impetus for change comes from the affective response to something that is not right, such as a perceived injustice or a rights violation. Although affective solidarity cannot change the world, as several scholars rightly point out, it demonstrates that a politically significant affective dissonance can generate solidarity through the recognition of shared emotions about oppression and injustice. I want to suggest then that reframing affective solidarity as decolonizing solidarity makes an important contribution to the argument that I'm making concerning affective decolonization as one of the decolonial options in challenging techno-rationalism at the university. Decolonizing solidarity is understood here as an affective practice involving the dismantling of the apparatuses of colonial violence, as those are manifested in various mechanisms of the university, from teaching and learning practices to research production and administration systems. The task of decolonizing solidarity requires work along two trajectories: the recentering of the settler as a site of uncomfortable change, and an effective politics and praxis of advocacy, accountability, and political commitment to indigenous, Black, and marginalized people struggles against colonization. Now, regarding the first trajectory, decolonizing solidarity is not a superficial, sentimental practice for white settlers to feel good about standing together with indigenous peoples, but rather it requires constant and uncomfortable engagement with the persistent effects of coloniality, such as an active challenging of epistemicide, settler superiority, capitalism, and the darker sides of modernity. In other words, this is not an abstract intellectual exercise for white settlers to do, but rather an everyday attitude and practice of challenging, resisting, and refusing the legacies of colonialism. Now, regarding the second trajectory, decolonizing solidarity has to be understood as an effective practice and politics that requires a process of advocacy, accountability, and political commitment to indigenous people's struggles against colonization. In other words, decolonizing solidarity is a deeply effective process that entails refocusing its goal on the effective practice of working against decolonization, namely on relationship building, a theme that we have heard in the past 3 days. Relationship building between indigenous and non-indigenous people, between former colonizer and colonized people, between privileged and marginalized communities. The question, of course, is what would sensitize or incentivize privileged academics, researchers, students, and administrators to engage in decolonizing solidarity. I want to conclude by briefly discussing how I envision a public pedagogy. I use the notion of public pedagogy here by Giroux and others, of decolonizing solidarity that would create openings for such sensitization in universities. And decolonizing pedagogy of solidarity is a public pedagogy that challenges social arrangements and their implied colonial logic. Here I understand public pedagogy as a form of politics and praxis that is as a social, affective, and political practice and intervention rather than a form of teaching methodology. If the pedagogical encounter is generally understood as a process through which those involved are transformed, then a decolonizing pedagogy is by definition a social, affective, and political process of transformation. In this sense, for instance, settler students or educators engaged in a public pedagogy of decolonizing solidarity as part of a public event or project that requires them to do challenging emotional labor that exposes their position of privilege are essentially asked to negotiate new relationships and practices with marginalized colleagues that are not based on self-interest, but rather on unsettled affective relations. A public pedagogy of decolonizing solidarity in higher education then requires emotional experiences and embodied learning through specific affective dissonance, action and change that create new ethical and affective relationships with others. To do this work, privileged academics and students must listen to the stories and especially the demands of indigenous, Black, and marginalized colleagues. Critical reflection and dialogue are valuable tools, yet they are not enough to challenge the coloniality of affects. Doing the emotional labor of affective decolonization in higher education means learning to challenge colonial structures of feeling, to not only see how coloniality becomes naturalized in everyday privileges, but also take action that challenges one's privileged positionality and affectivity on a constant basis. More importantly, in whatever form or a pedagogy of decolonizing solidarity takes, working with indigenous, Black, and marginalized peoples and their struggles means taking responsibility and commitment for reinventing our relationships and affective practices in the university classroom and beyond to become witnesses of affective decolonization. To conclude now, this provocation has argued that given the different forms of decolonization in higher education, it is crucial to consider how the affective dimension of decolonization may complement the work taking place at the level of intellectual decolonization and many other levels. My analysis has sought to provide some recommendations that would support affective decolonization in higher education. They are summarized as follows. To recognize the complex and difficult emotional histories of colonization in higher education institutions and explore how they impact universities. That was number one. Number two, to nurture effective practices of decolonizing solidarity in higher education institutions that bring together indigenous with settler educators, researchers, students, and administrators in renewed encounters. And number three, to inspire actions in everyday encounters that create new affective conditions which challenge the coloniality of affects. Thank you for your attention. That was it was misplaced.
Thank you so much, Michalinos. Another hand for our keynoter. There you are. So we will be going into the session that will be presented by Roxana. Roxana, you will come online now, and you have 15 minutes. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yes? Yeah? I'm seeing Andrea nodding. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, and I must say my feeling, my body now wants to be with all of you. And thank you, Michalinos, for that provocation. And I have been reflecting in similar lines to what you just said, but before expressing my thoughts and share with you, let me talk about my locus of enunciation, because I'm speaking from a very special place. I am in the border between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, in a historical moment where a country dreamt, a group of population, you may have heard that Chile was in a process of creating a new constitution, and it has been one of the few countries that after engaging in that process, the vast majority of the country rejected the proposal. And the proposal of that constitution had a lot of desires, intention of decolonizing in certain ways, recognizing the pluridiversity of the indigenous groups, the languages, recognizing the neurodivergence of different people, and guarantee a number of rights. And from that level of discomfort, right, when we engage and adhere the colonial intentions, noticing that you are living in a country with so many contradictions, and there is a big majority that is not aware, that doesn't understand, or wants a different type of future. So I'm speaking from that place and from that discomfort. The university where I'm currently working has an important percentage of indigenous groups, as well as immigrant people in a region that is highly affected by immigration crisis. So all of those contradictions to talk about the colonizing of affect. My work in the last years has been associated with how we decolonized body and mind. And I am having very inspired by the work of Michael Yellowbird, who has been talking about neurodecolonization and the importance of coming back to those contemplative practices of indigenous groups that goes exactly in a very similar line to what Michalinos just described, feeling that degree of discomfort, catching up those thoughts and those structures, those mental structures that shows that we're affective with colonial hierarchies. Those colonial hierarchies that deeply intertwined and embodied, right? I must say right now, my heart is pumping extremely fast and I can feel my degree of discomfort. And when you were describing, Michalinos, this idea of, oh, there is this superficial, this soft reform engagement of this decolonization, of effective decolonization, was saying, oh my gosh, maybe I'm not in that place, right? I'm just immediately thinking of that hierarchy of how we compare each other. I want to highlight some things that you said in terms of this, of how the importance of bringing the body back. with a group of colleagues here from Brazil, we're discussing about the increasing level of nationalist discourses, of how divided our countries are, especially considering that in Brazil just Lula won the election, but only for less than 1% more than Bolsonaro, completely different projects. And in that location, so what is our role as scholars that are embracing the colonial intention, that are in places of resistance, considering the role that we have to engage in different type of pedagogies? And on that, we were discussing about this idea of the decolonial Trump, of making visible that decolonial Trump that is at the cognitive level, as you were describing. So the intention to move the intellectual structures, to challenge the curriculum, to engage in different ways of creating knowledge, but yet still working within colonial structures. You said it perfectly right at the very beginning. These universities, that level of structure of the university that are so engaged in colonial hierarchies, that the action that academics can do are always undermined, constrained by those colonial structures. So what would it mean to live recognizing that we are in this engaging of a decolonial trap, in the sense that we try to move the agenda in a certain direction, and then you find all of those resistances. And at the same time, and I speak especially in my role now as an early career scholar, the way how functioned the publication, the publishing industry, and the importance of what that recognition in the scholarship is associated with how you are in the field and the voice that you have. So just there in that structure, the several layers, where is that, how we reclaim the decolonial affective? You mentioned very well in this in terms of the solidarity, the importance of engaging in a decolonizing solidarity. And that means to stand with. And when you were talking about this notion of standing with, and it doesn't mean to engage in a superficial way or recognizing our privilege, in the standing with, there is a political intention of dismantling that structure. And reflecting on that idea, I was wondering, who does that work? Or how we create a space to do that work? I have been exploring, and perhaps in a very imperfect way, with the practice of mindfulness. Mindfulness, you may have heard, it emerges from Buddhism. It has also the way how it's practiced in the Western has a lot of contradiction and is engaged and embedded in the colonial structures, but the possibility of engaging in contemplative practices to see how that colonial structures engaged in our ways of thinking and feeling, and trying to unpack those desires. And I reflect with all of you and with a lot of humility that in that idea, I notice that these desires, these colonial desires requires this constant inspection and several tries. But at the same time, I wonder if the exercise of doing it at the individual level, how effective it can be. Your question, your provocation really brought me to the question, who is doing that work and what are the spaces to engage in a decolonial affective dynamics? How we do create those spaces? You mentioned this decolonial pedagogy, but again, that decolonial pedagogy requires group. I feel extremely lucky of having a special of decolonial mates group with whom to do this engaging and recognizing that the work that we are doing is actually relevant, because the entire structure is telling me that I'm in the opposite direction. And those type of things, I really appreciate your provocation, because we get to the core of the work, right? How we advanced in a direction that really engage at the deeply level, at the core, at the heart, what it means to decolonize the spaces that first ourselves, and the structures that surround us. I want to pause here. I would rather prefer to have more time to talk and discuss. And I want to just perhaps finish with a poem that comes back to my own, by what I notice, my colonial affectiveness of who I am and who I appreciate myself, that is deeply affected by the structure of the university, the colonial structure of universities that highlights my productivity over who I am and over who my body feels. And here it is. Who you are is so much more than what you do. The essence shining through the heart, soul and center. The bare and bold truth of you does not lie in your to-do list. You are not just at the surface of your skin, not just the impulse to arrange the muscles of your face into a smile or a frown, not just boundless energy or bone-wearing fatigue. Delve deeper. You are divinity, the vast and open sky of spirit. It is the light of God, the ember at your core, the passion and the presence, the timelessness, deathless essence of you that reaches out and touches me. Who you are transcends fear and turns suffering into liberation. Who you are is love. This poem is from Donna Foltz. Thank you so much again for this opportunity and for engaging in this deeply genuine and also imperfect conversation.
Thank you so much, Roxana. Great stuff. Asiba, are you ready? And would you like to come? Oh, yes. Is this thing in your way?
Yes.
Do you need that thing as well, just to tower over this audience?
I wore heels today.
Okay, sure. Okay, I'll just keep that.
So deep, listen. Good morning, Molweni Nonke. It has been a very delightful few days being back at the institution that contributed, developed, and molded my scholarship and activism. And as I was looking at the room, actually almost all my CV references are here. So just in case someone wants to employ me. So thank you very much for thinking of me as you were planning this meaningful work, this emotional work, this emotional labor that Prof is speaking about. And also thank you, Prof, for your provocations. As a disputant today, I would like to reflect on the collaborative activist work that I am currently doing under the Social Justice and Quality in Higher Education program, which is a project housed at the Center for Higher Education, Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University, High Rocks. My PhD work, which looks at student experiences of gender in higher education post-mass fall movements and during the COVID-19 era from an intersectional lens. I am currently writing this deliberately in isiXhosa in English, particularly in the data analysis chapter, so that I do not lose the trail of thought as I am thinking in both languages, and also for the fear of misinterpretation and mistranslation and loss of meaning, amongst other reasons. So for some phrases here, I've tried to translate it to my English. So for some phrases here, I'll be translating for those who do not understand isiXhosa. I hope that as we are discussing the shifts in higher education and the CUS Decolonial and Transformation Project, bringing in the methodological shifts and student experiences will shed light of where we are in terms of social justice and the decolonial project from the lens of lived experiences of students in the Eastern Cape, which are located of universities which are located in the Eastern Cape. I've been trying to work on my lingo, South African universities or universities in South Africa, so I'm learning. So why the two contexts? The massful movement, someone spoke about it. So the reason for the hashtag massful movements as a context, it is to visibilize all other protests and movements interlinked with the most famous movements of Fees Must Fall. So as explained earlier, it also highlighted the call to decolonize the university space, but then again, the debates on student experiences years later continue in the context of COVID-19, exposed a need for more research to understand how the pandemic also highlighted inequalities in the higher education space. So the argument is that gender transformation within the decolonial project and inequalities were actually exposed as a need in the massful movements, and again, during the COVID-19 era in South Africa. There were many shifts under the banner of massful, and part of the conversations during that time were on decolonizing the curriculum and responding to intersectional systems that students and staff were subjected to. I remember during that time, just to respond to some of the questions, female students, particularly black female students, were part of the massful, and we are here. I remember during that time, part of our main argument, simple, it was for us to ensure that we leave the university space, a better space for the younger generation, as it has brutalized us, othered us, and bearing in mind how it was not structured with a black female student in mind, or a black student. As Prof delivered his provocation, I sat here thinking, well, what else besides the debates on changing the curriculum has universities done to shift or rather understand the narratives of students it has? Decolonization now. Sometimes they say, give it time. It won't happen in one night. Well, mine today is to reflect on the many nights that it has taken place. From a student perspective, by dissecting the ideology of transformation through reflective solidarities of the student voice. Is the university a space that I belong to? Can it be the space that I belong in? A few years back, I stood in this podium, battling with language and technological difficulties. Today, I stand as a PhD candidate and a lecturer. Of course, some may say, black child, it is possible. But for me, I wish for no black child to stand and face those issues. Why this work? Well, we all know, even from yesterday's discussion, that the pattern of hierarchical segregation across gender, racial, and ethnic lines encountered in higher education institutions in South Africa is particularly experienced by black female students who still find themselves discriminated against due to beliefs regarding maternal responsibilities and male supremacy, despite the existence of decolonial gender engagements and policies. Within this context of flux and change in issues of equity and equality, came COVID-19, changing yet again lives of many, particularly in South Africa from March 2020. The pandemic exposed yet again multiple intersecting oppressions that students face in the higher education space. Many students, those that we know, they face lack of access to resources as a result of being away from campus, increased stress and anxiety, and one thing that we never speak about, a home environment not conducive to studying, with some going back to homes which are a place of trigger in their crime scene for their being and past traumas. Is a university a space of escape, a space to build, a space to engage, maybe a space for a certificate, or just another institution as one to pass by for relevance? Who is the university for? Frontier, Fisher, and Ryan in 2021 reflected on how the pandemic translated to female students being expected to be caregivers at home while navigating online learning. Nobody's speaking about that. To what extent did the university have interventions for critical social justice issues to interrogate the complexities of equality and social inclusion in higher education as evidenced in student experiences, considering the focus of Decolonial project in higher education, which is on access, inclusion, and participation? Indeed, we need a critical reflection to unravel with the idea of how the structure of the university and its institutional culture might still co-produce the prevailing inequalities for students along intersectional lines. A time to look beyond access, epistemic access, by the realities of South African students from specific social groupings. One of such study by my supervisors, Professor Chris Bowie and Professor Sumakena, looked at the need for foregrounding students as social beings rather than as decontextualized from their social groupings. According to the authors, the context where students come from are structured according to different norms, experiences, and values, and this may or may not be evident in the university. These complexities are important in understanding student experiences and struggles. Other studies show that South African students who enter the university do so from positions of extreme inequality in terms of schooling, race, class, access to financial and other resources. And some scholars who wrote this are Chetty and Partha, Atitipa and Mlambo. So these dynamics of inequality affecting our students entering into the education space requires a research focus on the interplay of intersectional dynamics. Stripping that off, I would like us to focus on Kwimpikano from the narratives namava, impikano complexities, amava experiences that I have been collecting using a creative participatory method of narrative semantics. This methodology, with its very debatable limitations, has allowed me the space to be creative, to collaborate and be part of the research. There has been questions asking us to share light on how often we distance ourselves from the research environment for ethical reasons. How I wish we all had the privilege to distance ourselves from the social and economic inequalities that we research and write about. But for me, as I check my positionality, this project has offered me healing and a moment to share my own narrative of the higher education space, which I navigated with its brutalities and also the space for growth. So key to the narrative semantics is the interaction between the teller and the listener, or the researcher and the research participant. As I looked into the transformation of this methodology, I regarded the process as a collaboration between myself and my co-creators, so I do not have participants. As we write our different stories together, archiving our experiences. So some have often used spoken words, artwork as a reflection, while others offered poems to tell their stories. I remember when I went to engage in Walter Sisulu University, one of the students whom did not see the invitation came to me to ask for a conversation. She was a first year who said, "Molo sisi, ndiva kusithiwa ufuna abantu abanokubalisela ngobomi babo. Kudala ndifuna ubhodla." Meaning, "Hello sisi, I hear that you've been looking for people to talk to. It's been a while since I wanted to share my experiences with someone." Unfortunately, that conversation was not fully recorded because due to the emotional triggering nature and the narrative conversation that it came with, I had to choose between being a human being and being a PhD candidate who is chasing after data. In this work, I am contesting Patterson and Labov's methodology, but due to time and for the provocations that Prof shared, let me speak on some of the analysis that I'm grappling with. One of the key narratives focus on the idea of gender in language, the navigation of language with its different hierarchies for native students, while also reflecting on the gendered language experience that they have experiences in the space of higher education. One participant shared how they had to sit in class more than 5 years being referred to as ladies and gentlemen, while coming from a community of Xhosa speakers where there is less misgendering. Such reflections reminded me of the various work by Professor Zethu Madebeni, which centers sexuality and genders as critical points of view in decolonization efforts. On the other hand, one participant reflected on how easy it was. This was very, very interesting. How easy it was to engage with recorded sessions because of language difficulties during COVID-19 that used to impede on her articulation of curriculum content. So she mentioned how time-consuming it was to repeat the same video that the lecturer would have sent, but also how much she has passed since then. So as we reflect on the Decolonial project, perhaps if we stop assuming what the problems are with rural students, but rather listening to them, so that we can be able to implement things like the language policy and engagements of the curriculum moving forward. We have also been speaking a lot in conclusion about the meaning of space, and that has emerged, particularly the body as the space, in the data that I have collected. One of the participants said, Asipe, I hear you speaking about navigating space like the colonial structure of the university as you were speaking, Prof. Sisi mnandihamba noloyiko every day, because being a woman in this institution is a sin. Meaning each and every day, as a woman, I walk with fear in the institution that's supposed to protect my body as my space. As we reflected on creating space yesterday, I began to wonder about the discourse of understanding body as space and how best universities can respond to protect our spaces. So gender-based violence, as we understand, is a global phenomenon, but how do we then decolonize violence against women and many forms of violence against students? Again, the reaction and the recreation of heteronormative and masculine cultures in the university has been prevailing in the midst of decolonization and transformation. I was puzzled by one of the collaborators who identifies as a male. He shared how he was told that being in the university is another rite of passage for him, as he proceeded to share what it meant as a tool to have free access to women's bodies, as a form of strengthening manpower. Of course, as you were saying, it was an emotional moment for me, but it was also an emotional moment that required us to unlearn and relearn. That called for a moment of unlearning for him, as I grappled with the idea of how much work universities, through engagement, have to do to decolonize men and masculinity. So Prof. Sakumzimfekane and Ratele works on that. Because I am out of time, if I had time, I would have reflected on something that we never speak about as researchers, which is the notion of disconnecting as a researcher and the trauma or not of the research process, space for healing, and what Roxana usually calls a space for mindfulness. When do you retreat and when do you invest more? Thank you.
It's a very important task. Oh, thank you so much, Sipe, and of course for the investment of time in getting that presentation sorted out and delivering it to us. And of course, Ayanda, it's over to you. Are you sorted here?
I'll be shifting.
Is it okay?
Yeah. All right, good afternoon. I think it's an afternoon or a morning. Oh, it's still a morning, just 2 minutes before 12. Good morning. Firstly, I would like to say thank you to Prof, the DVC, Prof Kit and the team, Kit or Kiet, you know, when it comes to pronunciation and Afrikaans, but I know it's Kit. All right, and I also said yesterday that, you know, as English non-speakers, I'm Xhosa. English is not my home language. Therefore, you'll find that there and there, I'm not there, I'm absent. So you will bear with me. I'm starting first by saying thank you so much for the invitation and also seeing our community from Africa and far. It has been a great exercise. And thanks, Prof. Zembylas, for such a nice provocation. It's nice because it's talking about what I want to talk about. I'm showing you first these pictures. I'm so visual. I teach science, by the way. I'm a maths, science, and physics and biology teacher by training, and my degrees and everything is math and science. But I'm so visual. I don't like the objective, abstract nature of science before you entangle the visual. That's how I work from that space. You see the first picture that is on that slide, those rondables. These are pictures that I take. They're not coming from Google. When I was doing my PhD, I finished it in 2021, 14 December 2021. From 2019 to 2021, 3 years done. I was dancing on that stage. For those who were there, they know I did it. All right, I took these pictures because my study was done far away from here, in the deeply remote rural areas of our province, in Ngobo, deep down. So when I was going there, these rondavels, you rarely find them, but this is the architecture that you get mainly in those regions, the first one. But you move on, the last one there, when you're getting to the center, which is the center which houses the education officials, you get those houses, but still the structure is like that. You know, the rectangular house, we call them mamatande, rectangular houses. We are coming from those structures. Then this one, you also get some nicer ones like that. Why am I bringing this unto you? It's simply because I want you to get essence of what we mean when we say we are rural. We vary in terms of rurality. Some will say, I'm close to the town, it's fine for you. But for me, I am deeply rural. I am unolali. I'm coming from that space. Hence, I feel that every time when I'm going to talk about science or anything, I bring up my culture. This is my Xhosa culture. If you don't know, we dress like this. But we have those big dukes. Now, let me move on and then talk to this space. I'm just highlighting a few here. That is Professor Kit first. He's talking about all the talk on the pedagogy, the knowledge, you know, and things. He says that it's too much. There's so much talk in his 2014 publication. But he's saying that these are translated into the untouchable registers of the disciplines. It's the theory, but nothing is done about it. I'm taking those areas that I want. And then us as academics, we labor, we work so much to oppose, because now we are conscripted, we're forced to abide. But what do we do to a rural child coming to the university doing first year? This child is not good in English, hasn't been to a Model C school, has been taught in a rural school where the teachers are using isiXhosa as the main language. Because it's not that good, it's just that they want to explain and then take that concepts, then put the English concepts there. Then this child is going to write the exam in English, and this child memorizes. I'm coming from that generation. And then when they come here in university, they do that. We say they have plagiarized. They haven't. They go to the book, they cram it, move it from the line because they're used to that. So which means that as the university, we have a duty first to take first years on board. Maybe have a module where we are teaching them how to read on your own and write. And then secondly, you brought up the issue of technology. I think this one is the old slide, but I'll just leave it there. The issue of technology, which is adding to the challenge of the language. Coming to my colleague, the provocateur, Prof. Zembylas, he talked about the affective decolonization, which to me speaks so closely to what I do in my class, because I won't be so much into theory today. I'm not so good with theory, but I love to read and link that to what I do. Now, when I look at the work that I'm having here, I think about the issue of when I'm going to teach a particular concept, but feel that the diversity of my classroom needs me to be emphatic on the objective nature of science. But now, before I can do that, I have to sit home when I prepare my lessons, because you don't get these examples which are linked to culture simply by flicking a book. The CUS curriculum that is used by teachers, for me, I've taught the teacher for 26 years, with that being a manager of the math and sciences. I went on to be a subject advisor for life sciences. I've examined and moderated grade 12 life sciences papers, so I know what is happening there, that the CUS principles, they talk to indigenous knowledge, a specific aim number 3. But when you come to the textbook, there are no examples showing the teachers how to implement that specific aim number 3, which is you link the science content to the indigenous knowledge of the people. That's a gap. And I'm tackling that gap. And remember, when you talk about indigenous knowledge, you don't leave culture, you don't leave language. Those are intertwined. I think because of time, I'm just going to go straight here without quoting because I had some readings that I did. But now, before I go, I'm like a primary school teacher. I do things. If you don't know me, you will see today. Please don't be offended. I'm still a teacher. Even in class, I do that. My recordings for the practicals, I do that. But this one, I'm saying, replying to Prof's presentation and also the theme, all what has been happening, coming to us as South Africans, I feel that we have ideals that we got after being free from 1994. But since I'm coming from this background of being told stories, like having the makulus, the grandmas at home, there was no TV, and the mamas, they made stories for us. So I'm like that, I'm coming from that era. I feel that the rainbow is a fitting example because this one is coming from me. I'm saying all these ideals that we want our students to achieve, they remain as an imaginary, multi-hued, multicolored kaleidoscope hung up in the sky for our South African rainbow child, especially the rural one. And then as it's disappearing, also the hopes are disappearing because the ideals that were promised, they are not achievable. Let me quickly jump. What is it that I say I am going to be doing? I'm going to leave even that one, go to the illustrations. We say practice it, and not just theory of change. How then do we do it in science? I'll take an example from my PhD thesis, and I'm going to put a disclaimer immediately because science, biology is talking about sensitive concepts, so I want them to be comfortable with that. Am I excused? Yes. It's science, all right? Secondly, I'm going to be talking about killing of animals. Those who do not kill animals, please bear with me. Like if you want to teach the concept of sexuality, which is a taboo in many cultures, you are faced and it's examinable in grade 12. And you start doing it, it's supposed to be done in LO, in the primary school. Then how do you do it when you are using your own culture? Because I'm saying that we're using our own indigenous knowledge. We have cultural practice and even stories where we are told that the parents during the olden days in those rondavels that I showed first, they used to sleep in one room. And in that one room, there used to be a fireplace. Then in that fireplace, the fire dies and then it leaves the ashes. The mother sleeps on the other side with the kids. The father is sleeping on that side alone. Then, at the right time, you're going to ask me, what is the right time? You'll find that the mother will jump over the fireplace going to the father. We say, yes, in Xhosa, ukutsibi ziko. Now, why are you bringing this up? When you teach your science, it is biology in this case, there must be a differentiation between sexual intercourse and fertilization. But you find that our teachers don't talk about that because it is a taboo. That is examinable. So you move from the cultural teachings which desensitized the naming of the avoided terms, then you move on to the right ones. So they keep on laughing, okay, jumping over the fireplace, then you move on. Then lastly, I'm gonna move from biology. One story that rings into me is when I was doing grade 11, and my Afrikaans teacher had a book. I won't name the book, but the story was about a girl, Gessie, who was having mincemeat. This mincemeat, Gessie was apparently washing dishes on the sink. There's a tap. Rural girl, I've never seen a sink. We're using to the scottles, the metal containers to wash dishes. And then mincemeat, then apparently this girl, whilst she was washing, she was thinking, infatuating about a boy. Then the mincemeat went through. And I was puzzled. Firstly, what is mincemeat? I have never seen mincemeat. That's why I said that I didn't want to offend people who don't eat meat. Because in the villages, we kill our animals. We kill them. We kill the chickens, the cows. Then now, at what stage now? So I had to raise my hand and say, teacher, what is mincemeat? Because I was not stupid, I was a bit clever. So in that case, it helped others. Others knew because they were coming from good families. So why am I sharing this? The context is very important. When you're standing there as a teacher, teaching a subject which is so full of colonialism, like science, it means that take the context of the learner, especially the rural child, who has never seen these things, but they're shy to ask. But when you allow them to speak in my class, because I said I'm sharing how I'm doing it, they speak, I said, you speak any language, we break the English, I will fix it as we move. Such that even the African-speaking ones, they speak Afrikaans, we fix it, we go. Such that my class is so active, so active. Lastly, I think now I'm at 1 minute. I can use an example for teaching. The law, maybe the second law of thermodynamics. You know, when it comes to physics, feel like, whoa. Simple braai. I had even a backboard here, a backboard that we use with a fire. When you're going to make a fire, you take the wooden logs. What is there in that wooden log? Particles, but they're in a fixed state. But now when you put them in fire, they burn and then ultimately form the ash and the smoke. Thank you, my time is up, I'm wrapping up. Then the smoke, you're able to say to the learners, what do you think happens now when you compare the speed of the particles in that rock and the speed of the particles in that smoke? Then they will say, the smoke is moving faster. Then you have landed. That is the law of what? Of entropy. So you start with the familiar things, and then you go to the bigger science, and then you unpack what is meant by entropy. Then you go there. So in such a way, I'm saying, thank you so much, because I'm thinking about this rural child.
Okay, this is fantastic, no? So we're fusing the keynote input from Michalinos, which centers on the idea of unsettled, affective relations as a way of opening up decolonial possibilities, into the presentation by ACUSAfrica that deals with the labor of the black female academic and the emotional architecture that holds that particular work. But perhaps one also then has to extend, Michalinos, the responsibility for an unsettled, effective regime across various positionalities, because that extension provides for the notion of solidarity to emerge a bit easier. Not in equalizing terms, it will be a differentiated distribution, but nonetheless, because you don't want another dogmatic, effective position that is incapable of unsettling itself because it relies on so many truisms that it takes as the ultimate dogma. So that's the other point that we didn't want to go to. And Yanda, of course, I really loved it. I almost took out my notebook from primary school and started taking notes, but thanks for that. Now, pulling the question of pedagogy together, and Michalinos, in your own work historically, pedagogy as a project of the affect, you know, in so many levels together. So for me, there is a beautiful interplay between the three presentations. I just wanted to make that particular point. So when we then engage with the questions, we take that particular interplay into consideration. Okay, right. I am looking for hands. There. You see there, Sam, I told you, you must be in the first group. So I've got the 5, okay, right. It's Nomalanga Prem. I'm using now Prof's word for him, okay? And so Nomalanga, and then Sam, then Bongani, and Sipokazi. Oh, Nobu, you're also there. Of course, I will be in trouble. Jim? Right, so that will be the last question, eh? It's now finished, okay. Right, so I've got it. Nobu, you're also in that count, okay? And I also have to just say about this thing about the questions, is that we're going to start, just revitalizing our blog, Dina, for people to post their ideas that they can't raise in these spaces. It comes with, inevitable constraints, right? Events like this. And we have had people who, of course, indicated to us that there's not sufficient time, and they even made, appeals to us via email to say something. But because there are so many, you have to almost set up a special section of the conference to do that. And so Jenny and I discussed that we would rather than get a more interactive blog going, and that we tie into our event so that those discussions can then proceed. But let me then immediately put a sincere apology for that, even if it's time constraints that we don't have much control over. Right. So how did it go? So it will be easier for me this one, eh? Nomalanga, Preme, Sam. That's the first 3.
Oh, okay, thanks. I just, mostly it's for you, but intertwined. So I'm beginning to think that there's this thing that I call the fascism of the ally, or the allied discourse. I don't want to have to deal with the therapy for white people getting to know black people. That's not my problem. I really don't see how the so-called indigenous person must somehow create space where the settler will find themselves. We are very busy. So we have got to think about why allied discourse, what it means. And I think it's just a reinvention of the white liberal thing that Biko rejected. And it's masking itself in the soft tones. We declare this to be the land of the indigenous people. It's very distressing for black people when we know what the reality is. It's very distressing, the soft tones allied of liberalism. And as a challenge, in fact, what you presented, Doc, is that in South Africa, the most intelligent people I continue to encounter are those with a rural background. Because we don't mind telling you that we kill our animals. We don't have time for liberalism. And much of Africa, My African peers here can attest to that. So just my comment then that ties to all of you. Right now, Asepe, you are dealing with language, and it'd be interesting what happens in your thesis, but the language of liberalism is very suffocating. The idea that gender is a social construct, but only if we're talking about it in English, is highly oppressive. Many of our languages don't have pronouns, don't do gender like English. It is not our fault that the Euro-American North is having a gender battle. You are going to deal with black men who are going to go through initiation and have ritual and responsibility. You have to contend with that gender question excellently, Ngesxhosa. Because we can't have this liberal soft tones where everyone is worried about who's offending who.
Thanks, Nomalanga. Of course, the colleagues, you will have to take notes because if Jenny, how's our time looking for? I think that we'll probably go through only one set of 6 questions, isn't it? Yeah.
So then I'll be very brief. I just wanted to pick up on Ayanda's really provocative set of interventions, and it's about teaching history. And for years I taught the histories of the Eastern Cape, because many students came from here to UWC, and the difficulty around, for example, the histories of Nokause and the so-called cattle killing, and the ways in which it shifts in different moments when one is teaching. So if one were to teach it in 85, there would be a different set of debates to how one would teach it now. What I'm asking about is the archive of the materials that we use to build some of these historiographical projects. And then just very quickly, I wondered if you want to keep something like affect and aesthetics in a bit of tension. And partly it's that, that scene that you described from Fanon, which I think is a response to Althusser's "Hey, you there." And the child in that scene, the voice is coming from somewhere else, because that child doesn't have the capacity or the consciousness to produce a racial logic of that sort. So, there's been a big debate, we can talk about it, but it does seem to me that one would have to hold on to something of the creative. So I think we're on the same, and I really enjoyed what you were saying, but I wondered whether you want to keep affect and aesthetics a little bit in tension, because the aesthetic for me is a moment of seizing and creating. It's two different temporalities. It's kairos and chronos. It's kind of taking the moment and then creating, as opposed to the affective, which is often just a receiving and a translating of the problem.
Thanks so much, Pramesh. It's going to go to Sam. Sam, just hold on to the mic. I just want to foreground, because we have been doing it badly. The 2 online hands. Jenny, can they come? And then I know that that's captured, and we won't forget about them, and they will be part of the mix of the questions. Okay, yeah. So Suming, please go.
Yeah, thank you very much for these 2 sessions this morning. And something that's really been stuck in my mind since the earlier session was this being confronted by being told, I do not care if you die in the struggle. And I just want to remind ourselves of this pandemic that we are still living in, and nobody has mentioned it. So I feel like I need to mention it, because doing this work of decolonizing is very difficult. But we cannot do it if we cannot do anything if we do not acknowledge the losses and the struggle that is still going on, which is foregrounding this message that our institutions have told us to go back to normal, to behave like normal. But it is not normal. In my tiny little country, thousands and thousands of people have died. I just wanted to say that. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Mutsunai. Jenny, is he online? Unmuted or what? Not yet.
I don't know if you can hear me. I wanted to ask a question particularly to Dr. Ayanda Simai. Just that, I resonate with that. Sorry, my name is Mtsanai Nyamakura. I'm a student research assistant with Appreciate. And my question pertains to the all-encompassing for African students, because I myself am Zimbabwean. So half the time when you're in a classroom or in a lecture, you are of the belief that, this only applies to certain students and not all-encompassing for African students. So does this also apply to African students per se? And I think it can go across to the panel as well. Thank you.
Okay, sir.
Thanks, Prof. And the last two speakers have kind of echoed my thoughts. The first point I wanted to make for the last couple of days is the fact that we have focused on the university, and rightly so. But to some extent, I feel like we have kind of missed the point that the university is a microcosm of our society. And South Africa as a society is going through a number of challenges, inclusive of racism, coloniality, colonialization, which is power, and the abuse of power and the abuse of privilege, which plays out in the broader society and then plays out in the university. How do we change that within a microcosm of a society which is plagued by the fact that we can interrogate now how much our government values the Mandela values, which we were talking about yesterday.
Thank you.
How much affective solidarity do we have, and on which side of that solidarity are you standing? Looking at what is happening at UCT and some other universities, there are factions around particular kinds of solidarity. Why are you standing with that kind of solidarity? And the prof from Georgetown also spoke about that yesterday, when at some point the ANC itself was standing with the colonial powers for a particular reason. And then the last issue which has also come out is the tremendous challenge we have as a country with gender-based violence, which again plays out within the university. And the focus on the university might be somewhat myopic. I like the way the prof this morning now has brought in the issue of settlers versus colonial, the indigenous. And I think and I believe that because of every 1 million learner that goes to grade 1 and only 100,000 gets into the university, that is some kind of a settler group. We as academics, we are a privileged class, and we form part of the settler group within our society because we have privileges, we've got power, and some of us, even sitting in this room as academics, we get to abuse that power and abuse those privileges and then begin to function as settlers as opposed to being indigenous. So in closing, I think that we have tried in some way to expand, to engage with the issues, but the university is only a microcosm of our societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Colleagues, I'm going to go to Bongani and then to Jim, and then I'm going to come to Nobu and Sipokazi, and that's it. But I would like for people just to be a bit more briefer, if you can. Thank you so much. Bongani, Jim?
Thanks, Prof. I'll be brief. My question is directed to Dr. Simani. Simani. Oh, okay. With the issue of pedagogy and decolonizing it in this context, how then do you go, what are the extents of it when we bring it to the context of us as Africans, on the basis that the way we live in is very broad and has a very cultural connotation to it. For instance, how do we bring science to some of the things when we go consulted to amagqirha, abantaba who have spiritual healings? And then how then do we bring that aspect within the education sector and something as an aspect that students can be taught of and be discipline in itself? Thank you.
Thank you, Bongani. I just want to share with the group that now that we are running late today, the lunch is on time. Would have switched one of these 2 days over. And that's true, eh? The lunch has been ready for the past 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. I think I have just two questions. The first question is to Prof. Michalinos. I hope I pronounced that properly. Yeah. Thank you for that presentation on decolonization. My question is rather, can universities alone be able to drive decolonization on their own without the involvement of society in general? Especially moving from the understanding that universities are a microcosm of society. In a changing developmental society like South Africa, is it possible that this decolonization project continues without the active involvement? And what can society, wherein it is open to the general society, what can society assist in on the project of decolonization? And then my second question is to Dr. Smail. Okay, I pronounced that wrongly. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. I want to ask, are universities and university academics ready to use indigenous languages as a form of intellectual decolonization, if we are to take from what Prof. Michalinos just presented? Is it not strange that in a university such as Nelson Mandela, in the province of the Eastern Cape, a CUS dominated province, that we would not have still at this time an attempt to prioritize the CUS language in the same fashion that the Stellenbosch University did with Africans during the apartheid times. So I want your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So guys, you ready? Nobu, how's it gonna work? Okay, sure. Sibugazi?
Thanks. Hi, everyone, again. So just so that Nobu can get time to do her thought, I'm just going to just abuse the platform for a second.
No.
Are you sorted? Okay, cool. Dicolonial is also forcing me to do something that I don't want to do, and maybe I must also bring my positionality into the space to answer Bongani's question, because I don't know if anyone on the panel can answer that. Is that the first problem, maybe, Bongani, is you thinking that what I do and practice as a healer is not science. So maybe how you frame your question is where you must start to think about it for yourself, because that in of itself is science, right? And us thinking about it as African science and not just science is also part of the problem. My question is more directed to Asipe, but please, everyone can answer it. I don't know if at this stage you can, Asipe, just reflect on your journey, because the work of this panel is about how you concretize the human experience. How then, in your reflection of navigating Eastern Cape institutions, the ethical policies and committees, particularly thinking about how these institutions link themselves to the identity of the geography that they are in. How has that experience been in terms of engaging the process to acquire the ethics and then doing the work juxtaposed to what it brings out versus what the university is then still going to take your work as afterwards? Just that process and that journey, if you are able to. Thanks.
Thank you, Sibugazi. Nobu?
My question is directed to Asipe regarding, I suppose Asipe and Prof. Zembylas as well, regarding the affective dissonance, which is at the heart of feminist political activity, Asipe, you'll know. And this interesting dichotomy that you are experiencing where academia is telling you to be one thing and you're choosing to be human, and that feeling, that tension that's there as well. I want to ask then, how do we continue creating relationships or doing relationship building, as you say, Prof. Zembylas, when a response, Asipe, a form of resistance, refusal, and self-care for feminists
when it comes to affective dissonance isn't easy. Total disconnect from the space. So how do we continue creating those relationships in that context?
Okay, lovely. Thanks so much, Nobu. And just before I hand over to the speakers here, we also have to just try and frame our work in the context of Africanization as a contextualized form of decolonization. Okay, so then we broaden the debate with regard to its traveling capacity across the borders of our 54, 55 countries. Né? And that actually in the literature is coming through very strongly, okay? That we have to view the decolonial project within that context and Africanization as a contextualized form of that so that the discussion become a bit more inclusive. So can I start with you, Ayandas, as you said like this, and then give Michalinos the last word? And of course, and I don't want to do this, but you guys will have to be like five minutes. Is it okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, bro.
Can you see how they jump up there? They say that this international audience can't hear you.
All right, thank you, Prof. I'm taking that, that concern and also a comment from Prof. Nomalanga highlighting that rural people are rich in science. This is what I call cultural science, because we have Western science with the Western concepts. Now we need to bring in our cultural science. So I'm taking that point. You are giving us a pat on the back to continue doing what you are doing. Now, let me come to the second question. I think Prof. Prakash was saying, where are the archives? The nature of indigenous knowledge is that it is undocumented. That is the problem. I am in that process of trying to document it. I'm writing 2 things currently. To just go on, then I think I've covered you, Prof, in that case. Now, the third question is, when we are teaching these concepts using the culture that I know, which is my culture, Xhosa, does this apply to the diversity of my classroom? I would say yes. I use what I know and then I allow them to do and say what they know. I'm just going to illustrate. I said I'm a doing person. I'm just going to take an example of menstruation. I said I'm going to touch on those issues. We teach it. It's the menstrual cycle. There's nothing taboo about it. I would say in class, anybody's online, anybody who knows a fork spade. Fortunately, I've had students of other cultures, not black, saying yes. So with menstruation, you're like taking a fork spade or an ordinary spade coming from the Xhosa culture. You are lifting, we are lifting the what? The grass. Lifting on the grass, lifting the grass. Now, when you lift the grass, what happens? The soil falls down, and then you put it on that side. What happens over time? A new layer of grass grows. What is that? That is the endometrium. So it removes the dirtiness that is linked to menstruation, because without that new layer of the uterus, the lining forming, you will not be there. You will not be there. So the examples that we do, they cut across, and then we allow others to join in. My last one, I was doing a topic on technology, dealing with ions. I like collecting pictures, those old-fashioned ions that we used to put on the coal. Then I was showing them. It caught me. One African-speaking student sent me a WhatsApp at night, but I saw it in the morning on my other phone. He said, you know what? They say, Mefro, I don't mind the dog. Like I'm going to put it in English. My grandma, when I shared what we were doing in class, the types of ions and things, we went to the storeroom at night, And he came back. I put it in my portfolio of evidence. By the way, I'm a candidate for teacher excellence. I don't know whether I will get it. Let me say so. Let me say so. Thank you. Then that young man, he took a pic of that particular iron, it's small. That one, it opens up. I've never seen it. He says that the grandma told him that you put the coal inside and then it was used to iron the sleeves. You see, sharing your own culture, they share theirs, they learn the science. And we move on to our technical terms. And then lastly, I think I'm responding to the issue of amagqirha and what? Yes, I think Uspokas has covered me. But with science, I am not teaching the traditional way of healing. I'm linking tradition to Western concepts. Like umhlonyane is Artemisia afra. I have never been to a doctor when I grew up because my mom took umhlonyane from around the Rondaville, Artemisia afra. So we need to bring up these issues that our science is there, but we need to collect it and make it into archive so that the future generation can learn about it. I think I've covered all that were directed to me.
Thank you so much for the questions. I'll just be quick. The first part on politics of language, this is something that I'm also learning as I'm writing the thesis. First of all, the politics around italizing your own language and also the politics of translating in the paper. I don't do that. Ukupanda, someone who doesn't understand as they're reading my thesis will go and Google it or actually contact me. The other part on gender, there's something I didn't speak on, Prof, which is part of my analysis called social constructivism and biological determinism. As I was collecting data, Black students actually kept on asking, I saw somewhere in the documents you sent, you talked about gender. We don't talk about it in the interview. What do you mean by gender? Some people might think they do not know how to differentiate between sex and gender, but in my writings, I'm doing critical work in terms of why would they ask me, what do you mean by gender? Because in turn, I turn that question back to them, what do you understand by gender? So I'm drawing on the work of Prof. Zetu on decolonizing gender, as well as Prof. Kola on female in the dominant discourse. At the university, I'm existing in the broader society. This question has been bugging me and it kept on coming up. And to such an extent, I actually want to ask, what are you doing for your community as an academic? Because for as much as the university cannot transform the community, an academic as an individual can do that community work. One of the things that I've done for my participant is recreating with them spaces for their healing outside sending them to therapy. So that means them going back to the community, ensuring that they give the support to the students who are in high school so that they understand the context in higher education. That is also me doing the community work. Also to respond, actually, Pogazi, on the African psychology, there's discourse on African psychology and spirituality, which is indeed a discipline that writers like Professor Ratele and younger academics like Zilondi Wenkoke and yourself are actually embarking on. The process of ethics, differences, and administration. To be honest with you, I am in a structured PhD program, and that has been the best thing that has ever happened to me because I do not go through research in silos, and it is not a lonely journey. So in the application of ethics and administration, my supervision team and the other people that I'm doing the PhD program with have actually showed me that, firstly, you are a human being. Asipa, you are a mother to a 2-year-old. PhD is about administration. So you do that whole administration. For the whole year last year, I've been doing administration. Actually, this institution rejected my ethics application more than other institutions. So it's part of administration. Reading for your PhD is still PhD, but also the most important part for you to finish is writing it. So ethics application hasn't been easy, and I have a whole entire chapter on reflection on my process in doing this PhD, and that is where I've also inserted a poem of why I'm doing this work to archive myself in the process. Lastly, creating spaces and being human and chasing time and balance, one thing that I'm learning as I'm doing research is that the deadlines that are created, actually they're colonial in nature. If you are funded in a PhD program, they have their own timelines and their own diversity that they keep on insecting us as bodies. So you need to be able to take care of yourself. Prof. Roxanne, who's here, actually does sessions with us at the Center for Postgraduate Studies, where I work, that are called mindfulness. They actually teach you how to balance life, how to balance research, and how to balance work. And this is how I've been navigating this space, but also having a group like yourself, which is my safe space, where I go back to recuperate and also to strategize in terms of how to move forward. Who is going to do the work? We have to do it. Is it emotionally taxing? Yes. Do we receive backlash from the spaces that are supposed to support us? Yes. But we still need to continue doing the work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, 3 points very briefly. Numalanga, you're right that, you know, when you talk about allied discourses, liberal allied discourses, I'm not interested in them either. I think they're problematic, and I think I was criticizing liberal allied discourses. I was not talking about liberal. I think the example you gave yesterday about trust, you were talking about trust yesterday. So I think it's a wonderful example of, you know, how do you build trust between, you know, settlers and, you know, colonized people. I think if you say that you cannot build trust, then the conversation ends, and, you know, we shouldn't be here. We should looking for other solutions. So I think you're right, but it's not the only, liberal allied discourses, it's not the only interpretation or function of allied discourse. It's just one of them, very problematic. Primesh, you're absolutely right. We should keep them in tension. And if I had more time, we could go on. But you're right. It's a good point. And finally, Jim's question about, you know, decolonization in isolation from the society. Can you do decolonization, you know, apart from the society? I mean, the simple answer is no. I mean, you might be doing whatever you might be doing in higher education, disconnecting from the society, and it will have a certain effect. But if it's not a project, a societal, social and political project, then I'm afraid it's not going to go very far. And so the question I would ask in turn is, to what extent, to be fair to us, to what extent does the work of decolonization in higher education really make a contribution to the overall political project of decolonization in the society? So that kind of shift that, to be fair to those, or all of us who are, you know, struggling in this domain, not to undermine or overestimate, of course, the efforts and impact that we have. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I've learned something today that we must make a note of, Nobu. If you tell people that the food has been ready for 15 minutes, everybody sticks to their time. We actually saved some time here now on this, but thanks for that. But well done in capturing the entire sentiments and contributions from the participants. I'm going to invite Dina and Michael to join me here. Briefly, I'm going to give them each 5 minutes. Oh, please, the three of you, take your seats. Give them a hand. Yeah. And I'm going to give them each 5 minutes to do reflections as the co-conveners. And Jenny will then also join me just to do the thank you notes and the way forward. You know, we will capture, Dina, Michael, come. We will then capture the way forward. We will capture the way forward and do the different sets of thank you notes. But which one of you would like to go first? Michael, please.
So, my dear friends, John Henry Newman has this book, The Idea of a University. It's described as a culturally important a knowledge base of civilization, a book that is widely quoted, which has had myriads of reviews. Now, originally published, the idea of a university defined in 1873, the book is a collection of Newman's series of lectures defining the function of a university as training the mind instead of transmitting practical information. The mind is so powerful, therefore, that what feeds it is important, which is why some old university traditions prefer using the phrase, "What are you reading?" rather than "What are you studying?" with reference to their students, its students. When students are guided to read ideas, debate them, and dream to construct their own ideas, think about what transformation such minds can generate within whatever social world in which they find themselves. The power of ideas. The high conceptual framework of this colloquium around self-reflexive solidarities in Techno-Rational Times points to how historical processes and critical thought impinge on the mind and the ideas it generates to be it in relation with the common good we've been talking about, academic freedom, black feminism, inequalities of all kinds, but also opportunities for growth and development. I have made reference to Newman's 19th century idea of a university, but the university as a higher center of learning is not essentially a European idea. The university as an African idea and reality goes back to the University of Fez in Morocco. We've heard about that. We heard about that from Professor Techiwa Menu in AD 857, and others that followed, Cairo and Timbuktu itself. We heard that the African University in Techno-Rational Times already goes back to the ancient university. The purity and excellence characteristic of the ancient African university is beautifully illustrated by Ali Masri's description of Timbuktu as the mark of God, gold, and glory. GGG. God, gold, and glory for centuries. God represented religious traditions, and Masri was referring to African religious traditions as well as the Islamic traditions. We heard about the need to learn Arabic, for example, to help us go to those sources. And gold, trans-Saharan trade that exposed Timbuktu to the international world, international trade. And glory was scholarship, centuries of scholarship. So just fast forward, our network is determined through CUS to re-emphasize the glory of the African university today. Scholarship cannot be sacrificed on the altar of mediocrity. And to this end, we are grateful for the many brilliant ideas you have generated here at this colloquium. A wonderful cross-fertilization of these ideas through disputations and provocations. We would like to leverage this well into the future of growing this network on our continent and beyond. It stands to reason that the conversation we are having in our Techno-Rational Times should begin from a self-reflection on where we are with reference to knowledge production, engage with critical sources and critical people, as well as methods that have produced African ideas, such as the humanism premise has reminded us of again and again, all experimenting with those ideas, such as the Musizi University we've heard about. Such ideas will launch us into growth, I believe, and rekindle the glory of the African University. Thank you very much for your participation, and let's keep working.
Thank you, Michael. I'll be very brief and just talk about two things, because I don't know about everybody here, but I'm actually really hungry. And the idea that it's outside, it's calling me. But advancing critical university studies is still an open space. It's still up for grabs. I know, because we've been having conversations at lunchtimes and mornings and evenings, that there are some of us here who are wanting parameters, who are wanting certain punctums that can define what this is as a specific, distinct, and avant-garde thing. And I really thank you for your patience, for waiting, for wondering and wondering in both senses, for sharing, deliberating, disagreeing, the small conversations, all of those things, rather than closure yet, or if ever. I mean, my sense is, and I'm hoping that you're agreeing with us, that we still need to gather. We've had beautiful thinkers and doers here with us online for the past few years. We have them in textual form too. And it's been really affirming and also important to see more colleagues, particularly from the rest of the African continent and parts of the excluded North. Thank you for being here. We, however, need more meaningful contributions across the continent, intellectual traditions, linguistic traditions that need to be part of the vast and heterogeneous ways of thinking that are possible within advancing critical university studies. We really need to do more wrangling. So please continue the deliberations with us, but also pushing for the urgency, right? Because we can pontificate. Okay, secondly, I'd like to just take a moment as a person like Shirley Ann Tate, who's grateful for this home away from the institution in which I am an academic resident, to say thank you to Andre in particular for events like this and the affordances they create for all of us. I think it's also therefore really important to thank the people who have animated this hope and actualized it here. And I'm not just saying it as a Soma thank you. I'm saying thank you, Jenny, Michaela, Nadia, Neil, Fortunate, all the people at the back. The team for the small and large efforts that you've extended to make this possible again and again and again and again. We see you. You are visible to us. We see the labor. We appreciate it. We hope somehow you benefit from it. So I'd like to ask us all to just applaud them, please, and then when you get a moment, give them a hug. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Dina, for that, Jen. You all have to come up here, right? Colleagues, so just capturing some of the major, of course, apart from the intellectual, conceptual, praxis type of ideas that will be clustered by Luan, and that report will be out soon. just holding this entire debate together. And then, of course, Prof, if we then link it to the 2019 report, when we started this broader discussion, you will see, that there has been some movement in a direction that we do not yet have the parameters for, and I'm not so sure whether we should pursue any fixed parameters around that either, but I think that where we need to go to will come out in conversations in any case. So Luan will knock that together. And it's very difficult just by the richness of what we have heard to go through a clustering exercise. I don't think that's needed at all in any case because we have been here. But there are some things that I think that you will find very interesting and taking with you. The one is that we will be setting up the secretariat now at the University of Ghana. Geraldine, Geraldine, you were introduced this morning. Can you just please stand up? So Geraldine will, with the assistance of Michael over there. Michael? Yeah, okay. And they will be under the supervision of Michael here in front, and of course connect with the different, people across the continent. So Geraldine will create the listserv and communicate with the network partners, get that website a bit more lively. It's actually a lovely website, and then just get the discussions there going, make use, of the technology that constructs at least some of the tendencies of techno-rationality to produce the work and make our life easier in that kind of space. So, so Geraldine will start that work early next year. Then, of course, we have had generative ideas, and thank you so much for this. Some people actually came with plans to this colloquium. So we will have, a fairly strong East African network who already conceptually aligns itself because they also feel there's a need to revitalize the study of the university on the continent. Both at Makerere University, of course, with Jude and his colleagues, thanks so much for that. We'll try and get to Makerere early in January, and then also with Thabo and the colleagues, and Joe, of course, pulls that together as well. So there will be a particular intellectual hub emerging that will drive the work, and then we may well know, with Michael and his colleagues on that side of the continent, things will happen here, and then in Tanzania, we will have some presence, and then we will drive some presence also in Kenya, though Kenya will, of course, form part of the East African group in any case. So there is some work that's already taking shape. People are interested, and I'm very heartened by this particular commitment to study the university in a different, or with a different angle, at least. And then our interface with the Inter-University Council of East Africa, that will also be facilitated by our colleagues. And then we have to, of course, grow the South African network here. That's driven by Shireen, Aslam, and myself, and we will have to reflect on processes as to how that will do. And then myself, Dina, and Michael will then engage with the emerging networks that I have just mentioned. Okay, so we'll have a discussion and around that. So please give a hand to those who have just put up their hands, to pull this together. Okay, so. Then the interesting thing that then emerged, Crane, through your provocation, is that we will have to tag TIMS along, or CUS has to be tagged along with TIMS, insofar as the broader continental imagination, or the African imagination, is concerned. And of course, we will find a way as to how that will happen. I know that our university, at both the governance and the executive level, will be ecstatic if we drive the TIMS project beyond the borders of South Africa, against the backdrop of the Mandela Africa tour. In any case, prior, before he was imprisoned as well, and of course after he was released as well. So there will be a huge work for us that needs to happen there. So thanks for that. There's also a great connection then. Then from our side, and Dina has done some of this, but we will have to do this again, to all the speakers who has invested so much time in the preparation. And the things actually works out. The young people always comes up with these complicated designs for programs and so on, provocations and disputations, and people have to submit their abstract beforehand and their papers. And then the stuff actually works out. So thanks for that, Yeah, so to the provocateurs, the disputers, the authors, the respondents, all those of you who have attended, our colleagues from the continent, thank you so much for you have flown in, have these little chats. Of course, just open up both your intellectual spaces and your hearts, to drive this project with us. The facilitators who have done the work so well, those, of course, who have pleasure to be part of the panels as well, thank you for those. And then our collaborators, of course, the University of Ghana and the Queen's University Belfast. And then Thierry, to you and your team, it has been such a wonderful journey, since we have mentioned the possibility of the HSRC becoming involved, that you have just, walked shoulder to shoulder with us in putting this together. It's very, very affirming to have our Human Sciences Research Council walking this journey with us, being interested in the intellectual project, you yourself driving so much work around the university, the stuff that you've been doing around the exhibition and the book projects has been fantastic. That's apart from the fact that you are very, very nice people to work with as well, So thank you very much for bringing in the team and yourself. A hand to the HSRC please as well. And then, of course, to the NRF, who funds so much of this work, and for the past 3 years, that report will also be out, early next year, around the writing up of the 3-year project. It's not going to look too badly. We thought that perhaps we will falter in some of the publication spaces, but we have been catching up this year to meet all those particular kinds of requirements. We have already started talking about the meetings that we will have with regard to both conference and small types of funding, but also big fundings, which will be the responsibility that we will drive, the 3 of us, and of course, we will connect with other people in other parts of the continent and, of course, with colleagues in South Africa, so that we can drive this project, which I think everybody thinks is useful to do. And then the Sheila and Sipokazi and the team at the North Campus Conference venue, they have overcome multiple challenges, to be able to pull this venue together for us and to cater for us. I can't go into the nitty-gritty or in the detail of those challenges. That's for the university to sort out. But thank you to them as well. Okay, it wasn't too badly, but my apologies for some of the hiccups that went into that space as well. And then Ponzo, you and your tech team, lovely man. Give them a hand. And our comms and marketing people, and then of course the ETP office and the Krishet team. Now, I'm not going to say what the people have been doing, but I would like to recognize them by names. So it's Michaela, Vambizo, Fortunate, Nita, Neil, Noto, Slangi, Nadia, Ashali, Luan, Ayanda, Joe, Apiwe, Sine, Popina, Luandile, Vuyokazi, Bongani, Tanaka, Nobu, and then of course Jenny. Now, that's the team that have been making these things possible. And thank you to them. Now, some of you would have noticed, it's fairly obvious, that I'm actually not in charge of my research chair or of my portfolio. So I'm handing over to Jenny, okay, for the last one.
Andre, you mustn't say these things on live stream.
No, you've been behind this. Thank you so much.
So I'm not going to say much. I just really wanted to take the opportunity, firstly, to thank everyone who joined us for this colloquium. After all the emails, it's really lovely to see so many of you actually in the room. And for those who couldn't make it, to see you online, it's greatly appreciated. This scholarly and activist and practical collective that's forming is really exciting. And then secondly, and for me the most personally heartfelt aspect of this is just to say thank you to everyone who worked behind the scenes to make this happen, and very especially to the Crusade and ETP office teams. You guys are amazing. Working with you is one of the best parts of my job, and thank you so much for this. It's greatly, greatly appreciated. Thank you, everyone.
Now, our inaugural lectures are also held here, and I'm an expert in closing inaugural lectures.
Don't you have to close it for
Yeah, that's it. That's it. This brings to a close. This brings to a close this event. Please join us for lunch. Okay.
Not for everybody, not to the last lady.
Thank you.